Hello and welcome to WIDA. Today's event is the first in what we expect to be a regular series of discussions that WIDA will be hosting in the weeks and months to come with former trade negotiators and trade officials from the U.S. and around the world to discuss the week's news on trade. Every Friday, we plan to record a weekly video update on key trade issues that will be part of our Friday Focus newsletter. It'll be posted on our YouTube page and released as a podcast. It's our hope that this new media offering from WTO will help our community have a better sense of what's happening with perspectives offered by people who've spent their careers in the trenches, fighting trade battles on behalf of the United States and our trading partners. Before we get to today's webinar, as you know, if you've joined us for some of our webinars in the past, we like you to know who you are in community with on Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. You can see a snapshot of who some of these folks are on the screen, but I'd like to call out four of our distinguished guests today. Earl Anthony Wayne, professor at American University and the former U.S. ambassador to both Mexico and Argentina. Robert Holliman, the former Deputy United States Trade Representative. Bill Hite at Behrens and Partners and a former U.S. ambassador to Cambodia. And Carla Hills, the former United States Trade Representative. Welcome, Ambassadors Wayne, Holliman, Hite, and Hills. It's an honor to have you join us today, and welcome to all of you in the U.S. and around the world who are with us today. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom, and you should have also received a copy of today's event program by email, which has a link to our panelists' biographies. For those of you who've watched one of our more than 300 webinar panels these past 5 years, you know that the vibe we go for with these sessions is for our guests to have a conversation as if they're sitting at a bar and we're all at the adjacent table listening in. The virtual bar we're at this morning is named for the Exchange Saloon, which is a real bar just down the block from the offices of USTR and is actually my virtual background today. Our panelists have certainly shared a few stories and probably a few drinks around the tables at the Exchange Saloon, and I'd like to ask them to please turn on their cameras. We are grateful to them for joining us this morning, maybe with a coffee instead of a cocktail, but hopefully the conversation is just as spicy. Wendy Cutler, Vice President, the Asian Society Policy Institute, and a former Acting Deputy United States Trade Representative. Mark Linscott, a Senior Advisor for Trade Policy, the U.S.-India Strategic Partnership Forum, a Senior Advisor at the Asia Group, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, and a former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for South and Central Asian Affairs. Dan Mullaney, a non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, a former Assistant U.S. Trade Rep for Europe and the Middle East, who's coming to us from Ljubljana this morning. And our moderator, my good friend, Michael Smart, Managing Director at Rock Creek Global Advisors, a former Director for International Trade and Investment at the National Security Council at the White House, a former Trade Counsel at the Senate Finance Committee, and a member of WIDA's Board of Directors. Mike?
Thanks a million, Ken. Yeah, we are very lucky this morning to have three veteran negotiators. Among them, they have decades of experience negotiating trade agreements. I thought I might add it up precisely, but I didn't want them to get mad at me. It's a big number. And also, they've got unique geographical expertise as well. So we can dig into both the substance of the negotiations themselves, but also get some insights on how these various foreign trading partners are responding to the situation in the United States and the policies coming out of the Trump administration. So we want to do three things this morning. We want to, first off, dissect the week's events, beginning with the executive order that President Trump signed extending the pause on reciprocal tariffs, but then also the more than 24 letters sent out to trading partners. What it all means. Are the headlines correct? Is this a reignition or an escalation of the trade war? Is it something other than that? That's the first point. The second point, we have what is the substance of what is being negotiated? What is the framework for trying to bring these things together? What are the tactics that are being employed, and how would these veterans evaluate the strategy? And then lastly, we'll just take a tour around the world, focusing on the regions that Mark, Dan, and Wendy know best, and try to get an understanding of the state of play with each of these partners. So let me begin. It's been an incredibly eventful week that included the fateful date of July 9th. What do you make of it? Is this escalation? Is this an extension, allowing more time for negotiations? Wendy, can I start with you? Then I'll go to Dan and then Mark.
Sure, and it's really my honor to join this group. And as someone who has spent a lot of time at the exchange through the years, I love Ken's his screenshot. But yeah, what a week it's been. And if you look back on Liberation Day, this was the week that we were supposed to see 90 deals, right? 90 deals in 90 days. We've only seen 2 deals thus far, and that's with the UK and with Vietnam. And frankly, with respect to Vietnam, it seems that negotiations are continuing, even though a deal has been announced. Um, so my takeaway is that, and I think everyone on this group would agree, the administration bit off more than they could chew. That the notion not only of a 90-day period for negotiating deals is so short, but second, trying to do this with so many partners at the same time is really an insurmountable task. So I think it's only natural that there was an extension. But again, it's 3 weeks. Anything can happen in the 3 weeks. And we're already seeing certain trading partners already booking tickets or in Washington to continue negotiations. But what I find interesting, what our partners are saying publicly, and that's they still want to engage and find a deal. The private unrest and the private comments that I'm hearing are really leading me to think that we're headed for some tough times as we look forward.
Mark, Dan, what do you think?
Well, I think, from the European Union standpoint, the fact that there was an extension and thank goodness no letter kind of upping the ante is really is good news. I mean, the postponement, I mean, Wendy's right. This was a lot to try to do by July 9th. But I also think that the people who are anticipating or throwing out a standard of a complete comprehensive deal were really being unrealistic. I think what we were really looking for was some kind of a short agreement. I mean, I think it's fair to call it an agreement, but it'd be a framework. It'd be like the UK model, a few specific things and then an ongoing framework for discussion. So, I mean, had been expecting this week, if the July 9 deadline held, that with the EU you'd have something like that, like the UK maybe kicking the can down the road pending other discussions, and in part because the EU, I mean the UK, which is one of the countries I worked with, I think very quickly sat down and said, okay, let's figure out what we can do on this. Why do you want to have these tariffs? Can we, and of course, the UK do not have a goods trade deficit. So, what can we do? And they moved pretty quickly. The EU had a few false starts where they kept coming and asking the US what it wanted. And of course, they couldn't answer that question. And then there was a feint at retaliation, which was, I think quickly quelled. So having tried all the normal negotiating things, I think the EU has sat down and started asking the question, okay, so why do you want these tariffs, and what are the underlying motivations? And so I think the EU has been engaged in a discussion of the underlying subject matter, which is I think, despite what a lot of trading partners say, it's pretty clear what the underlying problems are. So, I mean, I think with this president, there's always a potential X factor of what could happen if somebody, a trading partner says the wrong thing. But this is sort of good news for me. This is good news that there's continued engagement, and minus something going off the rails, I'm relatively hopeful we can get something positive by August 1st.
If I can just chime in, I think Dan makes a great point. Like if you're a trading partner right now, you don't want to get one of these letters, right? You're not waiting by the mailbox. So Dan, I guess what you're saying is the EU right now is happy that at least to date they haven't gotten one.
No news is good news, Wendy. No news is good news.
Can I push you on that just a little bit? I mean, those that received the letter also received an extension of the pause. The numbers in their letters generally are consistent with the rates, the reciprocal rates that everybody will face on August 1st if no deals are reached. Does it make a big difference? Why do you think this additional element of political pressure and spotlight matter? Is that that's what I'm inferring? What do you tell me a little
I
bit
mean,
more
I,
about that?
I mean, I think, historically, when you've had these signals, and the EU, got one a couple of weeks ago when the president, kind of tweeted or posted on a Friday morning, that's it, 50% tariffs on the EU. And then, 48 hours later said, okay, well, I had a conversation with von der Leyen, we're not 50%. So I think these kinds of things reflect that the president doesn't think that there's sufficient engagement, whether true or not. And so it's a signal that he wants to up the pressure, from my perspective. And so the fact that the EU did not get that letter suggests that I think he hasn't been. There are no alerts on his side that the EU is foot dragging or not dealing in good faith. So that's why I considered the no letter to be a good news.
Yeah,
Mark, yeah.
yeah. So my take is, well, I mean, very much along the lines of Dan and Wendy. It's an extension that's positive. To some extent, I think it got lost a little bit. I mean, an extension was necessary. I mean, there's no way to do deals with many of these countries in that period of time. But it kind of got lost in the provocation. I mean, it was true. These letters are hugely provocative. I mean, the jaw-dropping in many respects. And I actually gasped when I started reading the one to Brazil. It was truly remarkable. So I don't know that it enhances the leverage associated with the negotiations much. To some extent, I think they were a bit offensive. Specifically on India, we were, those of us who follow India a lot, are very involved with that. We were expecting a deal. We've been expecting an announcement of a deal since last week. It was pretty clear that the negotiators on both sides had essentially concluded an agreement in principle. I think they've got the text in place and it's with the president. So why hasn't it been announced? And now I'm seeing like three scenarios. There's still a possibility of an announcement. That's best case scenario. I think worst case scenario, and this Dan alluded to this, is getting a letter. It's particularly after so much progress in negotiations, and I think there's been a lot of substance put on the table. To get a letter in those terms, I think would be a real problem with India. So in between is much better. Getting no letter, even if there's not an announcement of a deal, getting no letter is much better than getting a letter at this point in time.
Yeah, and I would add the extension applies to everyone with or without a letter. But one point that I would just highlight, and I'm hearing this from some ASEAN countries, right? Because I think all of the ASEAN countries have received letters, with the exception of Singapore, which has a trade surplus and is expecting, the baseline tariff. But if you look at some of those rates and you compare them to the rates that Vietnam has agreed to of 20 and 40%, certain questions are being raised. So, for example, if indeed Vietnam has agreed, among other things, to eliminate all of their tariffs for the United States and is still receiving a tariff of 20 or 40%, they're looking at that letter to Malaysia, for example, which is no trade deal, not eliminating any tariffs, and has a 25% rate. Or a Philippines, the same thing, but has a 20% rate, just like Vietnam. So I think an important dynamic here, and I think we're going to be seeing more and more of this, is everyone's going to be looking at what everyone else is getting. Because politically, if you go home with a deal and you've gotten less than particularly other close trading partners, and here I'd say the ASEANs will compare themselves and Japan and Korea will compare themselves, it could lead to a lot of opposition or no support at home for these deals. So it's just getting increasingly complex with lots of different factors on all of these countries' minds as they go forward in this negotiation.
If I could add here too, I mean, I'm glad Wendy brought up the Vietnam situation because it's been described as a deal, the second deal, but is it really a deal? There was a great New York Times piece a couple days ago about how the president views deals, that essentially anything he declares as a deal is a deal. He may view these letters as deals. And in fact, I think he made some kind of comment about, stating what the tariff will be is the deal. Vietnam, we've not seen a text. I wonder to what extent it was prematurely announced that the negotiators weren't done yet. But he had a phone call and he found it time to announce a deal. We haven't seen a text. I think they're still negotiating on tariffs. I mean, this claim of getting zero tariffs across the board in Vietnam, I'm hugely skeptical of. So, I think we're going to see this over time. There will be deals announced and they will be very different in substance. And it's going to be very difficult to dissect who's got a relative benefit versus those that really are kind of stuck in the same situation.
Like the old joke about you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun your companions, right? I think and one thing the Vietnam deal demonstrates, I think, is the degree to which the focus on China and what happens with the investments that were in China and the shipments that were coming from China. There's a heavy focus on that dynamic, which it plays heavily, I think, with Vietnam and some other countries. Maybe less heavily when it comes to Europe or the UK, but even in those instances, it seems like there will be a significant focus on two trading partners addressing the concerns with respect to China and non-market economy policies and practices.
Can I ask the three of you a question? You've all talked about how we've not yet crossed the finish line with these agreements in principle, other than basically the UK. That seems like a pretty simple and straightforward template. If it's just capturing kind of the status of negotiation, where they expect to go, a continuation of a low reciprocal rate, and then maybe some relief on 232s. Is it the 232 tariffs that are kind of the sticking point in some of these, or is it something else? Why is this so hard if it's such a light touch agreement?
So maybe I'll start and just say it's different for each country, right? And so for Japan and Korea, I think the Section 232 relief, not only from existing tariffs on auto parts, steel and aluminum, but also wanting some kind of special consideration or exemption from future tariffs that may emerge from some of the other 232s. For some of the ASEAN countries, I think it's the whole basket of either you want to call it economic security or provisions to address the China challenge. The ASEAN seem to be moving on strengthening their transshipment regimes. And I think that's very positive, but they're also being asked to, reduce Chinese content in their supply chains and maybe move on export controls and things like that, which for them is an extremely heavy lift, particularly in the wake of a very overt and strong Chinese threat. And warning that if you don't do if you do things that we don't think are in our interest, we will counter retaliate. For other countries, I think it's just this a continuous demand from the U.S. negotiating side to do more on non-tariff measures, to do more on tariffs. And I think countries are moving on these issues, but let's be honest, some of these non-tariff measures or tariffs are extremely sensitive for them. When I look at my career, probably one of the most tumultuous times when I was negotiating was what happened in Korea when we forced them to open their beef market. And that was only to beef under 30 months. Now we're asking them to open it over 30 months. And Mike, you worked for Baucus then, so you're smiling, you remember all of this. And so it's not even the commercial implication. It's just the word beef, the U.S., Korea, it just doesn't work. And I assume my colleagues, Mark, I guess it's the same for dairy in India. But, some of these Japan rice, some of these products are just so politically sensitive for these countries that they can't move. And the U.S. is like, we're not doing a deal until you provide us more market access.
Yeah, I mean, on that situation, so coming back to India and dairy, frankly, I think that there's been among the negotiators and even the cabinet level negotiators, I think there's been some sensitivity to the hardest issues. And I think India is in a bit of a different category. They started negotiations well before Liberation Day, April 2nd. Modi had been in Washington in February. They essentially started the negotiations then, so they were much further along. And the aspiration is much bigger as well. It's for a bilateral trade agreement, which obviously is not legally a free trade agreement, but in substance, that seems to be the intention to, it's going to look a lot like an FTA. And down the road, I mean, this is going to be a couple year negotiation. So what they've been working on in the last couple of months is a first deal, an interim deal. And I think the hardest issues have been set aside for the next phase of negotiations, and I think that's true with dairy as well for India. And again, I think there's a deal that was done, and it's not been announced, and it hasn't been announced because the president has his own calculus, which most of us don't understand, of what to do and when to do it. On Korea, though, I want to highlight. Wendy is the expert on Korea, and Korea to me seems like, wow, what can they do? There, as I count it, and Wendy should correct me on this, there were actually three renegotiations. So there was actually a first one, which was the May 10th deal back in 2007. And, Wendy led a couple of us ousters. I was the environment ouster at the time to go to Seoul and say, you've got to take this, despite the fact that there had already been a negotiated agreement. Then I think there was a renegotiation during the Obama administration and then during Trump 1. So, what does a Korea do? I mean, there's plenty for an India to do, but what does a Korea do in this kind of circumstance?
Mike, if I can interject, I think when you ask, well, why is it so hard? I mean, there are a couple of categories of barriers. You have the sensitive barriers that are not necessarily so complicated, maybe politically sensitive, but not complicated. So the UK agreement hit directly at beef quotas, so agriculture and auto. So like the kind of central sensitive issues, and they come out swinging with specific obligations in those areas. I think the 232 sectors are interesting because I think each one of those is complicated and presents its own unique problems. When you're talking about steel and aluminum, the issue is Chinese non-market excess capacity and how we jointly, we in the EU, we in the UK and others, push back against China. And do you use tariffs to do that and protect the world market from being flooded with product? Pharmaceuticals is another key sector that's got a whole different set of issues having to do with supply chains with respect to the pharmaceutical ingredients, pricing issues, the whole range of intellectual property discussions, patent term extension, data protection, and when you get to automobiles, which is the other sensitive issue, that too, they're complicated issues, but they're issues that we've dealt with for a really long time. But they're also very tailor-made to that particular sector. So I think that's why, for instance, in the UK deal, you say, okay, we've got a tariff quota for beef or whatever. Okay, for pharmaceuticals, we're going to sit down and talk about it because we have to address the supply chain issues and various other issues. So I think, at least the barriers can get divided into those two categories. We have complicated but well-known issues with respect to key sectors, and then broader issues about, if it's trade deficit, do you arrange more purchases of natural gas or whatever, or if there are horizontal regulatory barriers, sanitary, phytosanitary, or technical regulations. Those are a bit in a different category from the very bespoke issues that are attached to some of these sensitive sectors.
If I can add, I think Dan makes a great point there in that, we tend to lump all these 232s together, but in reality, they each are unique in their own right. I just want to go back to a point that Mark made, and this is one of my pet peeves with this whole exercise, and that is our FTA partners are being penalized here because they already have zero tariffs for us. So unlike in India or a Vietnam that has high tariffs and then can offer lowering or eliminating those tariffs, if you're an FTA partner, you don't have that tool. And on top of it, you thought you had a congressionally approved deal that was going to lock in this reciprocal tariff rate. So for countries like like Korea, for example, clearly they have some non-tariff measures that they can move on. But one of their, they do not have that tariff tool. Their tariffs are at zero.
Wendy, on that, they're certainly disadvantaged in the short run. In the longer run, do those FTA partners have a better opportunity of getting a better final deal, meaning something back close to MFN rates? Or how do you assess that?
There's no indication so far. If you look at some of our other trading partners like Australia and Singapore, they're just assuming that they're going to, be assigned that 10% tariff. Now, it is possible that, Trump at times says that tariffs could go below the 10% in certain cases. So I don't rule it out, but I don't think this White House is putting any value on our current FTAs. And I think that is just one more one more concern among our partners. Like, what do we do going forward? Are these deals worth anything anymore with the United States?
Right. Want to bring in some audience questions. We have several of them. Mark, you referred earlier to President Trump's letter to President Lula and how you were aghast. We have a question about that. What explains that very high 50% rate? What does it mean to add in, obviously, a non-trade related issue in the list of U.S. demands here? Can you elaborate a bit?
And only briefly, because I'm not a Brazil expert. But I mean that letter certainly went much further in being provocative than the other letters, and as you know, bringing in other issues. I mean just the content of the letter. It's just, and references to witch hunt, and it just was wow. In fact, that was my response with colleagues in terms of WhatsApp and text was wow. I mean that's all I could that's all I could say. And the 50% seems punitive. Clearly, it seems it's much higher than the other rates. It's different than the initial reciprocal rate, despite the fact that the situation with former President Bolsonaro was, that existed on April 2nd. I don't know what has really changed, but it clearly seems punitive, and it's bringing in, a political issue, as opposed to a real trade issue, which then gets us to what are the methodologies here? I mean, we saw the methodology on April 2nd, Navarro's methodology, and again, my response was, wow. How does this make sense? But now we have some new rates, and some of them have gone down. Some of the higher rates have gone down. A couple have gone up. But on what basis? What's the methodology here? Why? It's just really difficult to understand, and that doesn't help any country or the United States, I think, in terms of negotiating seriously and having credibility in negotiation when you don't even understand what's underlying these negotiations.
Yeah, I guess my reaction, based on the fact that the tariffs are supported by a national emergency arising from persistent trade deficits, that the Brazil letter probably did not go through White House counsel or the Office of Legal Counsel over at DOJ was my guess. Dan, we have another question here. Mark said that he thought the India deal was on the president's desk. Secretary Lutnick actually said the same thing about the EU deal. Do you have a view on precisely where that might stand? Is it just waiting for Trump's yay or nay as to its terms?
Um, my guess is that I think that that's right. I had understood that there was likely some deal that they were landing on. They had identified some landing zones. I mean, very short and sort of along the lines of some something specific, and then pointing looking forward to further broader discussions. Um, my guess is that they're continuing to work on that, continuing to refine it at the point where the president decided he's going to postpone to August 1st. There wasn't a huge impetus to get out a deal earlier. And since some of these issues are very complicated, if you're talking about autos, pharma, steel, and this plethora of regulatory differences that are barriers, why not take the extra time to see if you can get a little further. I mean, the other thing, and maybe it's a lesson that you can draw from the Brazil letter as well. I mean, we know this, but we in the trade world tend to view the trade issues as sort of one silo that we make exchanges within the trade world. And I think the Brazil letter is a reminder that the president doesn't see things that way. He sees things in much broader terms, which for countries in Europe, for instance, means that things like level of NATO spending and how much balking individual European states do with respect to military spending can also affect this deal. This is sort of the X factor. You can be doing very well identifying things you can do to remove barriers and addressing particular sectors, but then you could have a situation where one member of NATO in Europe starts balking at going up to 5%, and the whole thing could go south. So I think Brazil is sort of, among other things, sort of a timely reminder that the president does not see things in the same silos as a lot of the trade people do.
And we're going to get back to audience questions, but I want to pick up on something that Wendy opened earlier on China. It's really the one country that has not beat a path to Washington to make offers, make concessions. It's one country, one of a couple of countries maybe, that has retaliated. We now have an agreement that scaled back some of that retaliation on both sides, and a potential upcoming meeting between the leaders. I would like each of you to talk about, particularly as it affects your respective regions, what do foreign trading partners make of the fact that at the same time we're kind of advancing some fairly aggressive provisions on China bilaterally, and at the same time kind of taking a different approach in our own policies? Wendy, since you started it, would you please pick it up a little bit, and then we'll go to Dan and Mark.
Sure. And just, as news this week keeps unfolding, just in the past few hours, there has been press reports on Rubio's meeting with Wang Yi in Malaysia. Both are referring to the meeting as very constructive, and Rubio is talking about an upcoming summit meeting between Presidents Trump and Xi. And so I think our Asian trading partners, on one hand, welcome this, right? They want to see a warming of relations between the U.S. and China, given how integrated they are with the Chinese market, but given that it's very difficult for them to navigate between demands from China and the U.S. However, at the same time, they are concerned that in these negotiations, they are being asked to do things that are going to be probably viewed as provocative to China. And if China is going to take countermeasures, it's more likely for Beijing to take them against our trading partners and not the U.S. And so, again, it's just another concern that they're carrying as they sit at the table. On top of it, the China deadline for negotiations is August 12th. So that comes after August 1. And I think there also is a concern that they may end up with higher tariffs or tariffs equal to China. And so it's very hard to kind of walk through all this and to navigate and to figure out how it's all going to come together and how these different pieces are going to impact you.
Yeah, with respect to Europe, the dynamic is very interesting because for years, I think are one of the strongest points of commonality with Europe, the things that we could work together on most closely. And this goes back to even the TTIP days, if I'm allowed to say TTIP anymore, where one of the pillars of TTIP was global issues of common concern, by which we meant non-market economy policies and practices. And so, years ago, I think the U.S. and the EU were in very different places with respect to non-market economy policies and practices coming out of China. Over the years, I think our concerns have converged to a positive extent, that we do have things that we and the EU can do together, should do together, to pursue our common interests. And critically for the administration, a lot of the things you want to do, if you want to push back on non-market economy, excess capacity, and other issues, you're much better off doing that with allies, because otherwise China can ship products other places. So we have every interest in coordinating. So over time, we have moved into a very much more similar space with respect to working together on China. I do think that this potential specter of if the EU finally is convinced to work with us closely on China, and then down the road the United States cuts some kind of a separate deal so that the EU, having been convinced to take a hard line with respect to China and coordinate with us, is suddenly left out on their own with all their vulnerabilities in terms of investments and business with China. I think that's a real concern, and probably is an obstacle to full-throated cooperation with the United States on these sort of non-market economy policies and issues and practices, which would otherwise be there. So I think it's a real source of concern for Europe and an impediment to our potentially working together.
But Dan, can I just one point? It just seems to me that Europe isn't, I mean, Europe has its own problems with China, irrespective of US pressure. And that's really coming to the foreground now. So do you think, I mean, don't you think that maybe it's a little more nuanced than just US pressure that's evoking, these European statements and requests to China?
Oh yeah, that's a really good point. And I don't want to leave that impression. You're absolutely right. I mean, Europe has been learning its own lessons about China, because many of the member states are a bit more vulnerable to China because of high levels of investment from really big companies and trade dependencies. But I think over time they've seen some of the same risks that we have, so they have every interest in pushing back against China. But when you take that next step of actually, say, coordinating with the United States on, for instance, steel and aluminum, could you agree what we were trying to do maybe in the Biden administration? Can we agree to some joint measures where we sort of push back on this excess steel capacity? And then if the United States walks away, they're left out in the cold. I think what it hinders is not necessarily Europe pushing back against China, which is in their interest, but Europe coordinating in a full-throated manner with the United States on this, which, if you could achieve, might be an avenue to reduce tariffs, reduce bilateral tariffs, reduced bilateral tensions between the United States and the European Union.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue for all countries in many respects. So, India specifically, it's no great friend of China. There have been a couple of wars. They've got a huge border. There remain simmering military tensions. And India for a long time has shared concerns with China that are very similar to the U.S. concerns. Their largest deficit. India does have a trade deficit overall. It is not a surplus country, and its largest deficit is with India. And for years now, it has taken actions, sometimes with collateral damage to our exports and to other countries' exports into India, but they are mostly China focused. But in this circumstance, India, I think, finds itself in a very difficult spot. One, from the very start of the Trump administration, it's been concerned that we would go off and cut a deal with China, and India would suffer competitively. They view themselves as competitors in the U.S. market and in other markets with China. They've welcomed the opportunity to take investment from China into India for manufacturing, and there's a residual concern that we might actually provide China with better benefits than we might to India. And for the moment, I don't think that's a real scenario. There's currently what, a 30% tariff on China across the board, and then the 301 tariffs are still in place, but you never know what could happen. And then, on the issue of what is being negotiated in these individual deals, I sense that there's a template that's developing on economic security in all of these areas. And both Wendy and Dan have talked about how far are our trading partners and allies ready to go in being obviously anti-China, and what are the implications of that? I think almost all of them are a little wary about jumping, and India definitely is, about kind of jumping in that boat, agreeing to an elaborate set of commitments that are clearly anti-China. We have had the situation over the last 5 or 6 years with the Quad. The Quad has kind of evolved as a strategic partnership, but there's always been some queasiness on the part of India, and I think Japan and Australia as well, about how explicit is this partnership in terms of being all about China. So, I think that is going to be a continuing challenge in all of these deals.
We have a couple of questions, a few on Canada. So let me try to wrap them together. Why did Canada get a letter? The two leaders, they met in Kananaskis on the margins of the G7. Carney said afterward, we're going to have some loosely defined economic security agreement in 30 days. Trump then shut down those negotiations because of Canada's DST. Canada says, okay, we'll withdraw the DST, and they still get a letter. And there's reference to retaliation, but there's also reference to just kind of garden variety trade concerns that maybe folks anticipated would be addressed in USMCA. So now you have this situation where Canada, as usual, is taking more lumps than Mexico. Why is that, and what does it mean for the future of USMCA? Who'd like to take the first crack?
Well, I'd be glad to. Part of me thinks, if you're thinking of it alphabetically, Canada comes after Brazil. So maybe he's just getting to the C countries that haven't gotten a letter yet. But yes, quite a surprise. And let's keep in mind that, and I don't know the exact date, but there was a different negotiating time frame for Canada that was going to take us, I know, past July 9th. So I think that deadline at least has moved to August 1. But frankly, it's not been a good week for Canada. Let's keep in mind the copper tariffs were announced this week as well. And Canada is our second largest supplier of copper. 50% tariffs are going to hurt them, and they're already subject to 50% tariffs on steel and aluminum. So again, this doesn't bode well, in my view, for the USMCA negotiations. And part of me thinks that, maybe we won't even have a USMCA by the time the official review is supposed to start by July 2026. I don't say that lightly. I'm not hoping for that. But, given how antagonistic and provocative we are being vis-a-vis Canada, it certainly suggests to me that we're going to have some rocky times ahead with both of our neighbors. Mexico right now is in a good spot, but we'll see how long that continues as well. Maybe he'll get to the M's by the end of the weekend.
Yeah. I mean, my take is that Well, Canada's not only had a bad couple of days, it's had a bad couple of months. I think from the very start of the Trump administration, and for the president, I think often these trade negotiations and the trade relationships are personal. And he imposes those personal views on negotiators in many respects in terms of what the expectations are. And we had the situation with Trudeau, and there clearly was some tension there. We have a new leader in Canada, Mark Carney. They seem to have gotten off on the right foot, but I think there's still those residual feelings the president has on Canada. And what we're seeing play out with Brazil, that is deeply personal. So I think to some extent these negotiations with individual countries, ultimately the president is the decision maker. I mean, I think that's the situation with India. For some reason, he's not yet wanted to announce that basically an agreement, at least in principle, is ready to go. And I think everybody's waiting. So the president is the decision maker, and it affects all of these negotiations. And again, I think they can be quite personal.
Dan, do you want to jump in on this, or because there are?
I wonder how much he
I
loves the EU as well. So
I just I really don't know. There does seem to be a kind of a special thing with respect to Canada, and I don't know exactly what it is. But I'd like to point out that even though I'm in the EU right now, I'm actually in the country of Slovenia, which begins with S. Just in case anybody's watching.
Safe for now.
How long are you going to be there, Dan?
As long as it takes, Wendy.
Ambassador Wayne has a good question, and it requires each of you to kind of be domestic political analysts rather than trade negotiators and foreign policy analysts. But with all of the on again, off again volatility of Trump's trade positions, seemingly driven in some cases by personal pique and that kind of thing, is there a chance that there is going to be more domestic scrutiny of this approach, and that could bring about some kind of change, or we're just all sort of accepting that this is the framework and we just have to deal with it? What do you think?
My early take on this is that so far there's not been a lot of scrutiny. I mean, certainly pundits talk about it, Dems talk about it and scrutinize. Um, there are concerns among the broader American public about, inflationary risks. And I think recent polls have showed that there's not a lot of support for this trade policy, but those in charge of doing something about it, if there are concerns, essentially the Congress, the Republicans are just not, I mean, they're not challenging it. And I don't see that kind of, I don't see that changing anytime soon without there being some kind of shakeup there. And we could see some successes. I mean, so, we're talking about a lot of the negative implications, and there are so many, and it's so concerning, and just the brazenness of it is hard to kind of digest. But, eventually there could be some successes. I hope there are some successes that emerge out of this chaos. It would be really unfortunate if we've burned up relationships and then we don't have anything to show for it in terms of new trade agreements. It's one thing I do want to highlight too, in terms of the actual trade negotiations. I think the morale of the career trade negotiators was, in fact, quite high at the start of this administration because there were 4 years of basically doing no negotiation. But now I think they're starting to feel overwhelmed, and not entirely clear about what their mandate is. And I sense that morale may be kind of falling a bit now, 6 months in.
Yeah, I'd say, that, yeah, the negotiators are working really, really hard, and the teams that we all worked with were very much mission driven. So working really hard is really what they're made for. I think maybe I'm going to demonstrate that I am not the domestic policy expert, because I think the unpredictability and the volatility is a feature, not a bug, in all of this. I mean, it's almost as good to have like the threat of a tariff, and yes, a tariff, no, a tariff, than it is to have a tariff, because that already creates the uncertainty. But I think what we found recently is, say, in contrast to April 2nd, when there was a tariff announcement, the stock market went wild, the bond market more significantly got hit. Since then, we've had all these big announcements, 50%, a lot of unpredictability, and the markets really haven't moved or haven't really reacted. So I think we may be entering a period where the value of all this unpredictability and volatility gets diminished, and you may need to be moving in another phase. And so that could ironically maybe create a bit more stability as the administration uses different tools to pursue the objectives. I think Mark's right. Hasn't been a lot of evidence of pushback institutionally. Although, we'll see with the courts, with the Emergency Economic Powers Act, litigation at the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, and then the Supreme Court. I mean, some of the parameters might start being more sharply defined, and then, like I said, the maybe the lessened value of the volatility may mean that we could move into a different phase.
I would just pick up on and be really brief on Mark's point about Congress, because I think for all of us, we spend so much time briefing Congress, working with Congress, trying to get congressional support, responding to their concerns. And it's hard for me to understand like a world in trade where Congress just seems to be ceding most of its authority to the president and the executive branch. But Mike, you were on the Hill for a long time. I mean, do you think in the if I can ask you a question, do you think in the lead up to the midterm election that we may see a more active Congress pushing back on some of these policies, particularly if indeed some of these tariffs are indeed implemented? Up until now, there are a lot of threats. But if we do see a situation where some of these high tariffs are put in place, constituents are hurting, is there a scenario where under which this Congress would push back more?
Yeah, in my view, that occurs only in the context of a general economic downturn or a significant increase in prices, and a combination of the two would be very compelling politically. Of course, we don't see that so far. And even though we're talking about a kind of a relative period of de-escalation, but of course, tariffs are quite high, there is evidence to suggest that companies are nearing the end of their rope in terms of absorbing some of these costs and will soon be passed on to consumers. But unless and until that happens in a significant way, no, I think that's the only thing that would draw a response out of Congress. Where else should we go? One thing. So there was the big BRICS summit recently, and it was in a joint statement quite critical of various U.S. actions, drew a response from Trump. To what extent do you think that kind of competition, with the BRICS countries influences the individual bilateral negotiations, whether it's, Mark, with India or with Brazil or with China? Personally, I've sort of viewed this as a little bit of a sideshow, I've been a little dismissive of some of Trump's tariff threats against those who align with the BRICS, et cetera, but curious as to whether you have a different view and whether that's a dynamic we also need to keep in mind.
Yeah, my take is, well, first of all, I've been always, much of my career was multilateral, GATT, WTO, and the BRICS were always kind of a out there on the periphery in those contexts. And I've always been a huge skeptic of the BRICS on trade. That there never really has been a serious threat of the BRICS and a group of developing countries doing trade on their own because their interests are so diverse. I mean, Brazil and its views on Indian agriculture are, I mean, huge. I mean, they have as many problems with India as we do. So I don't think there's a real risk that the BRICS are going to do something highly substantive on trade for the foreseeable future. So it's kind of surprising to see the president react. In terms of the Indians' reaction, there's been some press attention to it. I don't think they see it as a serious threat. I think it's more rhetorical, but we're all trying to interpret this. The bigger concern, and we've talked about this throughout this discussion today, are the 232s. So sure, there's a presidential comment on 10% that would be applied to the BRICS and anybody associated with that. But I don't know that anybody yet sees that as a real risk. What they see is that they're negotiating with the United States and they don't know what they're going to get on 232s. They don't know what kind of sanctity there will be with these deals that they're signing up to. And then weeks or months later, they're getting hit with new tariffs because there's kind of these rolling actions on 232. So anyway, I see that as the bigger risk than a threat on, tariffs on the BRICS.
I agree, but I do think it affects the negotiating climate, right? Because even if you're India now, you're about to finalize a deal. You read this and you don't know where it's going, and so it just raises more uncertainty and more questioning. What are the value of these deals if we can be hit by all sides with all different types of tariff actions, going ahead. But I kind of agree with you, Mike, that in some ways I think the BRICS threat is kind of a sideshow. And frankly, I can't even, did that even happen this week? If it did, it must have been so early in the week because it seems like years ago right now.
I do think though that a number of the reactions from Europe and other partners is in this new context where the multilateral system is being disrupted, we need to build relations with other partners, which can be a positive thing, or is a positive thing. To the extent that the administration almost like declares war on other countries, siding or getting too close to other, to their partners, that does up the ante a little bit for entities like the EU or the UK. So it's potentially a troublesome signal of interference with trading partners' relations with other trading partners.
Thank you, Dan. Ken is back on screen. I think that means we need to wrap it up here. Thank you all very much for taking the time this morning to have this panel. And Ken, back to you. Well,
thanks. I kind of feel guilty breaking up the party, flipping on the lights at the exchange and telling everyone it's time to go home. This has been a great conversation. Point of reference, you guys have all been on our webinars before. Wendy's been on a lot of them. We had 42 questions come in. Might be a record for any WTO 1 hour WTO webinar. We know there's a lot of questions out there, a lot of thoughts about what the trade policy is. We are continuing this conversation. We're trying to get this right. I think today was a great start with you four. We've reached out to a lot of your former colleagues from USTR and the White House to be part of a rotating band. We're going to bring in some of our friends that work in other regions. We were just Wendy and I were just chatting. A friend of ours, Kelly Myman Hawk, who is on, I know, watching right now. is a Brazil expert. We didn't get her on today, but we're going to get her on next week. And we're going to have more of these conversations. Really grateful to Dan, Wendy, and Mark for helping us scheme out this plan for these weekly talk shows. They're not always going to be live. We're going to sometimes be recording these and then uploading them, but we are going to try to do this on a weekly basis if we can going forward. It seems like trade is going to be very active for the next few months and years, perhaps. So we're going to be here for you. Thanks, Wendy, Dan, Mark, and Mike. Really grateful to the four of you. And we'll be back and look forward to everybody seeing you all again soon. And thank you, everybody, for sticking with us for this whole hour. And have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Been fun.